I started off and I said, well, our earliest experiences are typically as performers, but I was wrong because it's as listeners,
Yeah.
right? And as a listener is the first time that you have an experience, potentially have an experience of being surprised. And people take those surprises in different ways. Um, Listening to music as a young person has the risk of setting a groundwork for truth, where then you think you know what music should be because, oh, I've heard all this music and that's what music is. And things that fall outside of that aren't, or things that fall outside of that aren't good. A lot of times, if people say that something isn't good, they mean it doesn't sound like the things they already like,
Right.
right? And so we can learn to be listeners that listen to things with an open mind without those expectations, but that's difficult. It's especially difficult if you are also a performer who has been performing a certain kind of music and that you've accepted that as the music that you like and you accept that as the truth of what music is. That could be anything though, right? I, that could be classic rock, that could be jazz, that could be some non-Western music. My father's from India, and growing up in India and listening to Indian classical music would potentially mean that classic rock sounds wrong,
Right.
or bad or surprising. Like, oh,
Yeah.
what is that?
Yeah.
Right. And so it depends on the kind, different people react differently to it. Is your reaction like, wow, what is that? I've never heard anything like that. Or is your reaction like, oh, that's not what I'm used to? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so practicing being wowed by things that you've never heard is sort of like a foray into being creative with your listening,
Right.
So what kind of music did I listen to growing up? Well, I mean, Michael Jackson, Beastie Boys, like this is elementary school. I remember my sister got a couple vinyl records. She had Thriller, and I would go in her room and put it on, and she had a Beastie Boys record, and my parents had an 8-track player, and they had a Queen 8-track cassette, and I listened to that thing constantly. So it was a lot of popular and rock and hip hop music for a long time for me, really until probably when I was 13 or something. I really wasn't interested in or hadn't been exposed to, really. It's not that I wasn't interested in, I hadn't been exposed to classical music, for the lack of a better term right now,
Yeah.
until I was about 13. But in ninth grade, I asked for a recording for Christmas of the New York Phil playing Shostakovich 5 with Bernstein
Mm,
conducting.
yeah.
I wanted that recording. I had heard it. Someone who was a senior in high school had that recording, and I listened to it once and I was like, wow, I need to hear that some more. And I got that for Christmas. From that point forward, I mean, I didn't turn into a Shostakovich fanatic. That was a piece in my early experience where I fell in love with classical music. I realized I was surprised by it. That's why it didn't sound like Michael Jackson. I was surprised by it. I said, wow, there's these things. My parents weren't classical musicians. They weren't, playing classical music around the house and stuff like that. So when I had discovered that world, I took off with it. And it was a whole different place for me to be. And I wanted to find out as much about all of that as I could. We didn't have internet to find it out. There was a used bookstore in town, and I accidentally picked up Aaron Copland's What to Listen For in Music book,
Oh, yeah. It's a
you
good one.
know, and actually didn't know who Aaron Copland was. I was just looking for music books. I
Mm.
was looking for stuff. I wrote an orchestra piece. I'm just fast forwarding a little bit here because it's all
Sure.
kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
related, but I wrote my first chamber orchestra piece when I was in high school, and I didn't know anything about string instruments. In fact, no one told me the double bass transposed, and I just knew what the range of it was, sounding range of it was. So my whole orchestra is full of these ledger lines in the bass
Nice.
part, and I showed it to the orchestra director at my high school, and I remember him looking at it and saying like, the bass can't play that low, and I was like, yes, it can. He said, well, but it's written an octave higher. You don't need all those ledger lines below the step.
Yeah.
And so I then realized like, what have I been doing not learning these things? I need to learn these things. And so I went to a bookstore and found the orchestration book by Sam Adler, but I couldn't afford it. It was too much. So I read it in the bookstore, like when I could. And eventually, and that bookstore was a Borders Books and Music store. And in the meantime, I had started, and I'll talk more about this later, maybe I had started a duo with a friend of mine where we would play like all different kinds of stuff, pop music, rock, experimental things. And we booked a gig at the Borders Books and Music store where the payment was a gift certificate. And as soon as that gig ended, I took the gift certificate and went back to the bookshelf that had that book on it and picked it up and bought it. And then I started learning about instrumentation and orchestration and instrument ranges and dynamic tendencies and all that stuff. And I was determined to write for all these instruments, but I still wasn't going to be a composer.
Right.
It wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
It was just fun. It was kind of a side hobby.
Yeah. You know, you're talking about what I would describe, it sounds like voraciously kind of seeking information. But when was the first time you actually encountered a composer in real life? And I guess the other part of this question would be, what was your first encounter with a living composer's music?
Yeah. Well, I have two answers to that. One of them is that the person who I met when I was 7, Miles Overton, who became my teacher, was also a composer, but really only a composer of percussion music that I knew of.
Yeah.
And so all the music that I was playing, a lot of the music I was playing was music he wrote. So in some ways, seeing someone like that write music that we were learning was kind of a composer experience, right?
Yeah.
But that was so normalized for me. You know, I saw that guy every week. That didn't seem like, oh, I met a composer. The first time it was like, oh, I met a composer, and this composer came and we played in peace. It was a composer named Mark Camphouse, who's
I'm
writes
familiar.
a lot of band music.
Yeah.
So Mark Camphouse actually didn't live far from us. He lived in Fairfax, Virginia, and we lived in Woodbridge, about 15 minutes away. And our band director at my high school was connected with him. I guess they were friends or something, or colleagues. And so we would always do Mark Camphouse pieces, and he would come to our high school and give feedback and stuff like that. And, you know, I remember becoming kind of a fan of Mark Camphouse is coming here, you know, the guy that wrote this stuff. And that's the first time I remember meeting a composer who we had been working on a piece of his, and he came and gave us feedback, and it was sort of magical. And I liked the music, so it was like, wow, this person is here, and that's something someone does. That also sort of like, I had said that it was so normalized already with Miles Overton in my experience there, but maybe because of that also immediately became normal to me too. Like, oh, there's all these people out there compose music, and folks are playing it, and sometimes they go like help them with it and stuff.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.